Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for coming out this evening. As advertised, I hope, though we haven't over-prepared this, that the conversation that we're about to have expands about halfway through, because amongst you we have historians, anthropologists, dramatists, the author of a book about walking in the footsteps of David Bowie. Projects which could be academic but have become something more, and probably something riskier and more exposing. And so I asked Doug, who we saw each other last, it must have been 40 years ago.
I was obviously very, very young.
And I was 18.
Yes, it probably was about that, yeah.
And so you haven't really caught up, but it's really lovely to see you again. Academic introduction. I asked Doug earlier what I should say by way of introduction, and he gave the academic answer, because Doug is an academic. He's a lecturer at Manchester University. He is a leading expert on James Baldwin. And he has now written 3 books about James Baldwin. The first, the book James Baldwin in the series Writers and Their Work, published in 2011. Then an OUP monograph, All These Strangers, The Arts and Lives of James Baldwin, which I made the mistake of mispronouncing as mishearing as the Afterlives of James Baldwin. But he's got several of those. He has recently, with James Riley here, co-edited a special issue of Textual Practice on avant-garde poetry magazines. He's a specialist on Jeff Nuttall, British polymath poet. And he's also written and is engaged with the teaching of American 20th century and 21st century literature more generally. So an impressive academic CV. But you're also the person who I last saw 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. And you're also the son of a brilliant, volatile, passionate, eccentric English teacher who was in his time an undergraduate here at Cambridge. And had he not been an undergraduate here at Cambridge in 1965 and attended a certain event at the Cambridge Union, you probably wouldn't be sitting here now. I think that's fair to say.
That's probably fair to say, yeah.
And this is your 3rd book about James Baldwin, but it's also...
Definitely my last.
Okay. But it's also a book that reads and explores James Baldwin in relation to your father, and your father in relation to James Baldwin. And you've just published it. It's about to be published next week, in fact.
Yes, the 19th of November, I think.
Yeah. And this is the first conversation that you've had about it.
Apart from a few with myself, yeah.
And family.
Yeah, I have.
And I think that's quite important. Yeah.
But I haven't. Yeah, I mean, I've got 3 sisters. And my mother's very much alive and very on the ball. But it's not something that they have asked me to run by them, which is kind of interesting. So, I mean, the book it's part memoir, part literary criticism, part history. It's a kind of hybrid book in a way. It's not an academic book. It's very much a trade book. But it was interesting, I think, because there's a lot of personal material about my dad. And I asked my mother, who is Scottish, very kind of very straight talking, really. And I asked her, I said, would you like me to run by this? And she said, no. There's a kind of trust there, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. Your first 2 books are, you say in the course of this one, as I think most academic books are, driven by a kind of obsession, or a number of different obsessions. And you use that term. And amongst the obsessions that drive you is an obsession to understand the importance of place in a writer's experience. What is it that excites you as that literary detective, that sleuth? Tell us how you express and the lengths it's taken you in pursuit of the third person in your relationship with Ellie, your wife. You described this at one point.
Yeah, I think in terms of place, I mean, Baldwin, how many people have read some Baldwin? Can I ask a few? Okay, most people. It's kind of interesting because when I started working on Baldwin in the late 90s, very few people were working on Baldwin. He's had something we might touch on, he's had a fascinating afterlife, as you said earlier, in terms of the title of my second book. And place has been really important, I think, for Baldwin. It's important in this book, which I've got, the copies didn't arrive in time from the distributor.
So that's why you've got 30% off if you order it online.
But it's there. Place is very important. So Baldwin was born in Harlem in 1924, almost exactly 20 years before my father. And then in 1948 he moved to Paris and spent most of his life either in Paris, an intermittent decade in Turkey, and he died in a rather lovely place, St Paul de Vence, if anyone's been there. And if you do go to St Paul de Vence, I can recommend the Column d'Or if you've got quite a lot of money. It's very expensive. I went there for my 40th 10 years ago, and I went with my then fiance, and she went to bed about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I carried on buying drinks for people, and I racked up a bar bill of €650. I didn't realise how expensive drinks were. She didn't tell me until a few years later, actually, which was very good. So she's very understanding. I don't think I would have been quite as understanding, actually. Place is really important, and I think for Baldwin it was very important to get a critical distance from the United States of America. And at the moment, if you live in America, it's probably something that you definitely want with Trump back in the ascendant. So place is important in that way. For my father, it was very important because he was born, he just happened to be born in Cheshire, which is where his father was stationed, who was in the RAF. But then he spent his first sort of chunk of his childhood in different countries. So he was living in Egypt for a while, he was living in France, he was living... there were actually bits and pieces I don't even know about my father. And because he was an only child, there's no real way of me uncovering some of these details. So place is really important. Thinking about what it means to be in a particular place, whether, as Baldwin writes in Giovanni's Room, which is a novel that I imagine some people have read, a second novel set in Paris, published in 1956, that home is not a place, but a irrevocable condition, he writes, and what that means. And then in relation to my father, who suffered from Alzheimer's disease, place becomes particularly important because you're unmoored or unanchored from any sense of place or being. So it becomes the very simple facts that we're used to, if you don't suffer from dementia, where you're familiar with your surroundings, suddenly they become foreign to you. They become a kind of a different, or another country, as Baldwin, to borrow the title from his third novel. So place becomes really important. So, and then place where the idea of home, a care home, which became my father's home, what that means as well. So my father, I think about 4 years ago, moved into a care home and then eventually a nursing home. And that notion of home, again, for me, was very kind of resonant as I was thinking through what that meant for my father.
One of the things that I heard in that lovely answer was my father suffered from Alzheimer's, which has only been true for the last month, because you wrote this as you had lost your father.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a kind of, I think with dementia broadly, I mean, Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, for those, in case people don't know. But it's, and there are something like every 3 seconds globally, someone is diagnosed with dementia. But actually, there are, and as we live longer, of course, there are going to be more and more cases. It's a kind of pandemic in a way, which is just growing and growing. And that's something we might touch on later. But it's, yeah, I think in a way I felt like I'd sort of losing my father and my sisters. I've got 3 sisters. We were losing our father for 3 or 4 years, where he was unsure of who he was, because memory is so integral to a sense of who we are. Goes back.
And absolutely integral to Toni Morrison, but also Baldwin.
Baldwin and
the distinction between memory and history.
Yes, yeah, crucial Baldwin. So, you know, one of Baldwin's mantras, along with Toni Morrison, is that history is, of course, ideologically skewed, but memory and larger cultural memory becomes a really important part. You know, works like Beloved by Toni Morrison, which was published the year that Baldwin died in 1987. So, yeah, and in some ways, I think I've been sort of mourning my father, the person who I knew, and then he died October the 6th. So there's a kind of another sense of, something becomes very finite, and I think there's a way of, you're right, as I was writing the book, he was still alive, but very much a different person to the man that I knew, the father that I knew, and I was very close to him. And then, so there's a sense of him sort of ebbing away. And it was hard to keep track of things. As I mentioned earlier, lots of details that I just couldn't find out. I think I refer to them as shadow details, bits that are irretrievable.
So your obsession with the third person in your relationship with Ellie took you to the place in the Nice where Baldwin lived for his final years, and into his house.
Yeah, I did. I broke into his house on my 40th. It was you know.
Was that before the 650?
Yeah, it was. It was before. It was quite a wild weekend actually. When I say broke in, I didn't think I committed any major crime, but I just sort of hopped over the wall. The house. So Baldwin died in 1987. He died intestate. He thought he bought the house. Other people said he didn't. It wasn't his house. There'd been campaigns to turn this beautiful Provençal house into a writer's retreat, but then it's been razed. But yeah, I think I've had an obsession with that for a while, and I think there's something. It's quite dangerous in a way. So, for example, I went to Loesch-les-Bains, Lucabad, in the Alps. In Switzerland, to visit where Baldwin wrote his very famous essay "Stranger in the Village," and it's dangerous in a sense because you, as I talk about the book, I don't think you can, particularly as a white person, have a sense of how Baldwin felt. That's not what I'm saying, but there's something that, you know, I'm not alone in this, that other writers feel. I mean, you've had this with, we can talk about this with Hughes.
Absolutely. Where
you standing in a river a casting where Hughes had been, there's something, and it's quite hard to describe. You know, it's something. There's something that seems to transcend the logic of literary criticism and so forth. But there's something quite magical about it. But yeah, I've been the Schomburg Center in Harlem. Been many times. I've been to his favourite bar, El Faro on Horatio Street in Greenwich Village. I've been to various places, and it's a way for me. I think there's a real thrill of being there, and it doesn't have anything. It's not necessarily useful in terms of. It's not like useful in the sense of going to an archive and finding something, but there's something in a way more important. There's a kind of. Do you feel that with the Hughes? I mean, with the Hughes, where you talk beautifully about discovering particular fishing spots, for example.
Yeah, I became so obsessed with fishing at the right time of day in the right pool in the right river, and then catching a fish where he'd caught a fish, that it began to infect the memory of my own earliest fishing experiences, and I couldn't be sure but those memories were as real as the identification I felt for Hughes in those places, which was an extraordinary worrying to start with, and then reviving and refashioning opportunity to reimagine and renegotiate the relationship that I had with my 3 elder brothers. So we came closer together, but partly in pursuit of disputed and different memories of our father, who took us fishing but never fished with us, whereas Ted Hughes fished with his son Nick, and that was at the heart of their relationship. And I, in reading Walking in the Dark, I really envied you your relationship with Richard, your father. And it goes back to his experiences in Cambridge, and I want to come back to that, and the Baldwin-Buckley debate at the Union in February 65. And actually something you've just said, of Baldwin, there are, and it's less surprising in a way, and less poignant, there are inevitably irrecoverable experiences, which don't matter because the writing wreaks the transformation of personal experience into something which is narratively right, or discursively right, or rhythmically right. And the power of the prose or the story matters. But you say in the book that you don't know why. You can't know why Richard, as an undergraduate of Fitzwilliam, went to that.
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I mean, I think he told me that he went to 3 lectures in his first year as an undergraduate.
As a director of studies?
Yeah. And he tended to read what he liked that wasn't necessarily on the curriculum, which I, as a professor of American literature, I fully endorse, actually. I think you should, up to a point, you've got to play it a little bit, play the system a little bit. But, there's a balance, isn't there? And he didn't quite get it right, perhaps. But I don't know why, in the sense that by the time he'd mentioned this, and I'd sort of remembered it, him going to the Baldwin-Buckley debate, but by the time I wanted to finesse those details, he couldn't remember them. So there's speculation. I don't know whether... I mean, I know that Baldwin was in London, and he was on a book tour for the Corgi edition of Another Country. So I know that. So there would have been some newspaper coverage, etc. And for the younger members of the audience, this was pre-internet, if you can imagine. It wasn't even in black and white in those days. It wasn't even there. So people were radio, newspapers, and Baldwin was a big figure. And by that time, he was starting to become a well-known civil rights activist as well. But I don't know exactly why my dad went. And in some sense, it doesn't really matter. He went there. Perhaps on the suggestion of a friend, perhaps because he had...
But it really matters that he did, because, I mean, it's really striking. I was taught by your father, who was also my assistant housemaster, and I got from school and schoolhouse at Shrewsbury School the love and support in the years after my mum had died that I wasn't getting at home from my father, who was a GP, but I honestly, emotionally, completely inhibited and inarticulate. Whereas Tom Weir, housemaster, who I only realised recently was Richard his best man? Or anyway, they formed an extraordinary friendship. These two men, they gave us, boys of my year, the most extraordinary love and support, and partly because they were as expressive and as fun, and Tom, I don't know whether you've read what he's written about Richard, described him as howlingly funny. David Profumo, who's become a friend as a result of working on Ted, told me of Richard's propensity to insert buttocks into the title of well-known literary texts. So it's the buttocks of the Western world, So things like, and he dressed very, a combination of kind of tweedy plus very vivid colours, well before Michael Portillo developed this. Yeah?
Yes.
But with complete conviction. And he would come into a class and say, expand, explain, explode, when he wanted you to say something. And he'd, with Bill the Bard, and he taught me for O-level, and he taught us Mansfield Park, but it was Mansfield Pork. He was very, very unpredictably witty and alive and attentive, but he never told me about Baldwin. So what did he tell you about Baldwin? Because he has become the third. He's become so important to you.
I remember him telling me that he went to the Baldwin-Buckley debate. So William F Buckley, who was a suave, Yale-educated conservative, who, interesting, I think, would today have been cancelled or, in the inelegant term, deplatformed because of his views on the South. I mean, he was. I mean, some of Buckley's stuff is just outright racist, and he'd honed his oratorial skills at the Yale debating team, where Baldwin had learnt his as a child preacher, as a Pentecostal child preacher. So very, very different. And my dad told me that he went along, and he just told me that he was blown away by Baldwin's charisma and his political conviction. So that combination, and he and his friends, he just said, were very turned off by Buckley, and which is encouraging, good to know. But then he didn't really tell me much more about it. And then, as I say, by the time I wanted to find out more, I think it was also one of these things where Baldwin had been very important then, and by the time he would have been teaching you, Baldwin had sort of fallen off the... And
by the time after Shrewsbury I went to Oxford, none of our white male tutors ever mentioned Baldwin. No. And in fact, it's only, I can confess, only because of you and this book that I have read Baldwin. Taking far too long to act on my son's passionate enthusiasm for Baldwin for the last couple of years. But reading Baldwin now and starting with Giovanni's Room, there is this, and then learning more about this through your book. At the end of the first chapter of Giovanni's Room, David, who has come to Paris as Baldwin did, essentially to escape from his father, says of his father, I did not want to know, not anyway from his mouth, that his flesh was as unregenerate as my own. The knowledge did not make me feel more like his son or buddy. It only made me feel like an interloper, and a frightened one at that. He thought we were alike. I did not want to think so. I did not want to think that my life would be like his, or that my mind would ever grow so pale, so without hard places and sharp, sheared drops. He wanted no distance between us. He wanted me to look on him as a man like myself, but I wanted the merciful distance of father and son, which would have permitted me to love him. Which is that merciful distance between father and son did not exist for Baldwin and the man who, until he was 16, he thought was his biological father, then discovered he was his stepfather.
Yeah, so Baldwin's mother, Burdis, had Baldwin, James Jones actually, he was originally called, out of wedlock. And she was part of the Great Migration, moved from Maryland up to New York. And he was about 16 when he overheard a conversation between his parents, realised that David Baldwin, who he always refers to as his father, was not his biological father at all. And that came just to, 16 is, I've got a 16-year-old son. He, touch wood, is doing, seems to be quite doing all right. But there's it's not something you want to hear at any age, particularly that kind of age, I think. And it's right at the moment where he's starting to discover his sexuality. He's having an affair with an older Harlem racketeer, as Baldwin describes this guy. And he's a child preacher. And around that time, his stepfather, as he now knows, David, says to him, you've got a choice to make. You can either stay in the church as he did, David Baldwin, or you can write. And luckily for us, Baldwin chose the latter, and the rest is literary history. And Baldwin leaves the church and leaves home on that day. And Baldwin's relationship with his father, which I talk about in the book, is really complicated. He was someone who he feared. He was a disciplinarian preacher who forbade young Jimmy Baldwin to have white friends, to listen to jazz, to go to the cinema, to go to the theatre, or to write. And yet he kind of admired his father as well. There's a tension there. It's not as in, the great aspect of Baldwin's work, I think, is his refusal to shy away from complexity.
Absolutely.
And this is true of his portraits of his father.
Yeah.
But then, which leads me actually on to, later on at some point I'm going to read just a few pages of the book. But Baldwin found emotional sustenance from other father figures. Richard Wright, to a certain extent, not emotionally, but Richard Wright supported him. Richard Wright, after Native Son, was the most famous living African American writer. Baldwin knocks on his door with a tattered manuscript, then called Crying Holy, which becomes Go Tell It on the Mountain. And Wright's very supportive. They have a whiskey together, and Baldwin is so nervous. He's nervous that he's going to fall off the chair. Doesn't really drink at that time. Baldwin gives him Wright from Mississippi gives him a huge bourbon, and Baldwin doesn't really drink, and he's worried. And then there's a lovely description in his essay Alas Poor Richard, where Baldwin says he told Wright more about his book than he knew himself. He just sort of speaking. You imagine that nervous energy. And then when Baldwin moved to Paris, the first major essay Baldwin writes is Everybody's Protest Novel, which really pulls apart Native Son and Wright in particular. And the two became distant. Wright felt that Baldwin was a kind of Freudian drama playing out. But then prior to that, at the time when Baldwin was having this very difficult discovery about his lineage, he's introduced to the painter Buford Delaney, who is a fascinating figure, and he becomes Baldwin's spiritual father. He lived on Horatio Street in the Village in New York, and he's queer. He's an artist. He's from a church family, and Baldwin is, wow, this is incredible. And he talks about how Delaney helped him to see, to look at the world around in a way that hitherto he'd not been able to. So Baldwin was fortunate, perhaps, to have those figures around. Delaney is a really interesting figure. There are some. If you Google Delaney and Baldwin, there are 3 or 4, maybe 5 portraits that you can find. And he almost made it. Delaney as a figure. Henry Miller wrote an essay about Delaney, which gave him a little bit of uplift, but he never quite broke through. From Tennessee originally, and then Baldwin invited him over to France.
But Delaney wrote wonderful letters to him.
Incredible, yeah.
Which you see reflected in Everybody's Protest Novel, which are raging against the fetish for black and white as categories, and for every other kind of category. And revealing that the memory and the individual was complex, suffering, generous, and outdoing and transcending mysteriously any category. Is that a fair?
Spot on. I mean, Baldwin had a real aversion to what we would call now identity categories. Yeah. We didn't want to be called a black American writer who's like, I'm an American writer. He didn't like being called, as it would be then, a gay, and then as the terminology shifted, queer writer. He really felt that those categories pinned him down or caged him, as he talks in reference to Henry James. So yeah, Baldwin was very suspicious of those, and he talks explicitly about this in a number of his essays. This real resistance to categories.
But that makes him absolutely urgently contemporary for today.
Yeah.
And again, my very, very late discovery of Baldwin includes Notes of a Native Son, where his father died, and on the day of the father's funeral there was a riot. And reading this at the weekend and talking with you this week, within a week of the election results in the States and what's happened, rumour. This here. So, after the funeral, do you mind if I read this? Because then you need to read it. While I was downtown desperately celebrating my birthday, a Negro soldier in the lobby of the Hotel Braddock got into a fight with a white policeman over a Negro girl. Negro girls, white policemen in or out of uniform, and Negro males in or out of uniform were part of the furniture of the lobby of the Hotel Braddock, and this was certainly not the first time such an incident had occurred. It was destined, however, to receive an unprecedented publicity, for the fight between the policeman and the soldier ended with the shooting of the soldier. Rumour, flowing immediately to the streets outside, stated that the soldier had been shot in the back, an instantaneous and revealing invention, and that the soldier had died protecting a Negro woman. The facts were somewhat different. For example, the soldier had not been shot in the back and was not dead, and the girl seems to have been as dubious a symbol of womanhood as her white counterpart in Georgia usually is, but no one was interested in the facts. They preferred the invention because this invention expressed and corroborated their hates and fears so perfectly. Perhaps many of those legends, including Christianity, to which the world clings, began their conquest of the world with just some concerted surrender to distortion. Surrenders to distortion, driven by hate and fear. See, it could not be more contemporary, could it?
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you read that, and you read that very, very well. It's great actually hearing it, because when you read it, if you get someone to read it just for you, do it. I'm kind of hearing it differently, it's great. Yeah, that bit, it reminds me of, for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, but William Burroughs threads through my book quite a bit, quite different to my dad, but there are some sort of parallels. And I think it was Burroughs, my friend James Riley, who's here, will correct me, but I think the earliest use of the term fake news that I've come across is from William Burroughs in the mid-60s. Was that James? The Revised Boy Scouts Manual, where he talks about in that, very much in that context. Is that? But Baldwin here, Baldwin's so aware of the official channels, and a lot of his work, as you alluded to earlier, is about contesting and clarifying the difference between memory and history. That passage, you're right, and Baldwin's afterlife has been absolutely fascinating. His suspicion and rejection of identity categories and so forth seems very, very contemporary, and yet he was ostracized for precisely those categories, what we'd now call intersectionality, which of course then wasn't a term. So, for example, when Baldwin was trying to break into the civil rights movement from the late 50s, he was frequently left out of major marches, that March on Washington, and he was his nickname on the scene was Martin Luther Queen, and he was and it was a kind of a way of trying to kind of limit the power that he had. I'm not saying that particular nickname, but one of many ways. So, for example, he's on the front of May the 17th, 1963. The reason I remember May 17th is because that's my birthday. Is So there's a picture of Baldwin on the front cover of Time magazine, there's a very striking painting of him, and then the unnamed author of the piece describes Baldwin as full of overblown arguments and fretful, and basically describes him as he's a heroine in a 19th century novel. And there's a way of tacitly undermining Baldwin's credibility as a race leader, as people were starting to talk about him, by saying like he's gay, he's got no ability or authority to speak about these issues.
But judges ruling on the obscenity of naked lunch felt fastened on representations of homosexuality as the worst. I mean, that whole period, that mid is a fascinating. One of the things that's remarkable, though, I just want to bring Richard back into this, because that merciful distance that David in Giovanni's room refers to, that he needs between him and his father. Some of the things that you tell me about Richard, your father, in the book, you tell us, I think, and makes me feel that there was an enviable intimacy between you. So Richard was uninhibited completely about his body. He would wander around in the house naked, as my father would. But my father had not represented England as a schoolboy at football. My father, it made me recoil. I think Richard was just more comfortable in his nakedness and his sexuality. Tell me what he told you as a teenager about sexuality.
Yeah, the only time I remember him saying anything, we had one very awkward conversation about my dad saying, do you know the kind of birds and the bees conversation. I just remember it was in a car that my dad often did these talks in a car, and because you were kind of travelling.
But you don't have to make eye contact, do you?
Exactly. So you're staring ahead. It's good, actually. I've only just learnt to drive, which is quite just in time for my older kids. But but then he said to me, the thing I remember was he just said, never assume that you're heterosexual. And I thought this is in the 80s, and I thought, it's quite, I thought about that as quite a progressive way. And he wasn't trying to be. That was just when he was an undergraduate here. I years ago met somebody who said, we were talking about this earlier, but that my dad slept with anything with a pulse. So male, female, whatever. So
anything with a pulse.
Yeah. So I don't think but my dad wouldn't have categorized it as bisexual. Just.
Whereas my father was a general practitioner, born within 5 miles and 18 months of Ted Hughes, who had a certain reputation, and Dad was a GP, and the closest we ever got to the birds and the bees conversation was when I was at Oxford. I'd met Sarah. He knew I'd met Sarah. I said, Dad, do you think you should... Do you ever tell... What do you think about the facts of life? And he said, as a GP, he said, I think people should find out for themselels. And that was I did, but that was the end of the conversation. So the contrast and wonderfully, I think, though poignantly too, you've inherited your father's desk.
Yes, I do, yeah.
That's an amazing thing.
Yeah.
But you have chosen, in terms of, we talked a little bit about the moment of discussing this, but the moment of writing this, you could have chosen to write this, to wait until you could have written My Father Suffered. Everyone in the room has read that extraordinary essay that you wrote in the TLS, in the present. So, could you just say something about the moment of writing, why you felt you needed to expose as much of yourself and Richard, and maybe then that might lead you into reading something. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it wasn't, as rumours have it, wasn't my gambling debts or anything like that. That was kind of... No, I think, for me, I'd been thinking about my father a lot, obviously, and then I wanted to do something... I mean, I write, although we talked about the distinction between academic other forms of writing, and I've written for the TLS for 20 plus years fairly regularly, and I've written quite a few of the freelance essays. So it was a way of...
And people have seen that one about Zen fishing as well.
Oh, Zen, Zen fishing, yeah. So it was a way for me, I think, of trying to make sense of something that I didn't understand, that I think is perhaps unknowable. A narrative is something that threads through this book. It's a way of me trying to gather up the threads of a mind which had been completely overturned. It's not that I'm trying to, or think that I have the ability to understand what he was going through, but it's a way for myself and perhaps my family, and hopefully for people reading it who may have a loved one or a friend or that's experiencing suffering from dementia, to recognize that as well, because it's quite a lonely experience, I think. I'm very fortunate to have 3 sisters. It's something, and I'm number 2 age-wise, but I'm very much at the bottom of the pile there. Fiercely intelligent, I'm sort of, I don't really get a look in and never did really growing up, but lots of ways. But I'm very fortunate to have that. But writing was a way, certainly not cathartic. I'm very suspicious of that term, actually. It's a term that's used, but useful as a way of setting down, trying to understand. And I think, in a way, it's fascinating. There are more and more books that are trying to, and films, Still Alice, for example, that people might have seen, where people are trying to make sense of Alzheimer's and dementia more broadly. It's not something I think that can be done easily, but for me, it was really important to attempt it and to write about moments that were not necessarily comfortable either. There are some moments that I don't include about my father. I had my own sort of boundaries about things. Bless you. But there are, I think the process was very useful, if not cathartic. And I'm a little bit worried, to be honest, because we scatter my father's ashes on Saturday. Sunday is the memorial service.
We'll be there. Yeah.
The book is out on Tuesday. It's a funny kind of but my sisters haven't read it, so I'm kind of a little bit nervous about it.
Your sisters haven't read it?
No. I said to them and to my mum, would you like to read drafts? I'm happy to not include certain. And they said no. So there's a kind of burden, responsibility, but also this burden of trust as well. And I feel a little bit nervous because everyone has a different version of their childhood.
So, I want you to read, but what you've just said, I have 3 elder brothers, a younger half-brother, a stepmother. I was very worried indeed about what my stepmother would think of this, and then she had a stroke. And though language is coming back, she doesn't read. So, but she might. My half-brother, we have never had a conversation about this. My elder brothers, when Dad died, I was my half-brother and stepmother were going to get someone to the presiding priest, to say something, and I said, "Don't you want someone in the family who knew?" And they said, "Well, if you'd like to do it." So then I wrote to my brothers who were all over the world and said, one memory, because I had 7 minutes for this, one memory of Dad, and they all without conferring, came back with the same day on a Scottish fishing holiday. And my eldest brother said, "It was that great day we went fishing for mackerel and we caught tons of mackerel, it was wonderful." And my middle brother said, "It was a terrifying day because Dad was out in this boat and the current was taking us out to sea and I thought we'd never get back." And my youngest brother said, "It was a borrowed boat and it was bolted together and I was convinced the boat was going to come apart." And then I found 2 photographs among many, because he never fished with us, unlike Ted and Nick, but he took photographs of us fishing. And there was this photograph of my 3 elder brothers on the sandy beach at Achmelvich in Sutherland, each of them holding a trout. And they were just staring down reverentially. And it was captioned, "The Catch, Trout." And I'd written a poem and a book of collective poems called "The Catch." So this kind of weird coming together. And then I found a photograph, and I thought it must have been 2 years later because they went back. And it was of the three boys, and they were tussling over mackerel. And Chris was looking proud because he had the biggest fish. Julian, the middle brother, was looking terribly unhappy and upset. And Nick was just looking mischievous, pulling the mackerel from... And that was it. And I showed this to someone else. No, I showed it to my two brothers who had by that point read the book, but they had we'd never discussed it. And my elder brother, corporate lawyer to the core, this is being recorded, said, I don't think this is 1968. Because in the background, there was a pram with a little surf of white blanket visible. And then I showed it to someone else. An artist friend, Kate, and Kate is important, she said, and there was a caravan in the background as well, with a kind of reflective, and she said, "Who's that in the caravan?" And it was my mum. And then my youngest elder brother, Nick, also a corporate lawyer, said, "Mark, I don't think you're in the pram." And Mum was looking down, absolutely seraphically beaming, though this was just background, and clearly I was having my nappy changed on the table. And so, but this was all about Dad taking photographs of his sons catching mackerel, and a day that they remembered. And then since I published this, so this is just a cautionary thing for you, but good luck with it, my brothers very quietly said, "Your memory, your account of the night Mum died and the day after was not actually true factually." But I'm so glad I didn't. We've had conversations about memory again, and about the suppression of memory and the richness and variability of memory, and ultimately that's brought us together. And I don't know whether Catherine is here, but Catherine said when I published the book, "I don't know how you could do it, it's so exposing." There will be colleagues of yours who read this book, and you reflect in the end of the book about the limits to which art can go in capturing Alzheimer's, and there's a moment when, and you quote Burroughs right at the end, where we get beyond words. And you quote Burroughs as a critic, but I do think this book, Doug, is art, I have to say. It's not literary criticism. It's all the richer for being as exposing of yourself and Richard as it is. So
yeah, thank you. I think there's, as I say, there are moments that I pull back, and I think these are fascinating actually. Some things I've been fascinated in biographies as well, where moments people do. I mean, there are certain things which I'm okay to say here, but I wouldn't want to write about. My father, was incontinent towards the end, and there's certain things I didn't want to kind of write about that in the book. But somehow I feel okay to mention it. But there are things that I didn't want to have that as a kind of fixity to that in the book. With your father, though, do you think he was? I'm really fascinated. I'm really talking about this in the book, which I absolutely love. But the way that he was documenting your child, but not necessarily participating, is that a sense that?
Absolutely. He was always so.
A distance.
I've had the important conversations with my sons, the older adopted sons, while driving to fish, because you don't need to make eye contact, which British men are incapable of, but you can say things together, and by the riverbank, and Mari Heaney remembers Nick asking Ted a question about his mother Sylvia, and Ted would say, "Let's talk about that when we're fishing." So there is a kind of an emotional space. But sorry, what were you anyway?
No, I was just curious about that. I think that it was fascinating that your father wasn't fishing, but he was. It was a kind of protection somehow. He was enabling, wonderful. He gave us some extraordinary experience, but he was never a part of it. And so I really envy you
Richard from that point of view. Though, of course, mourn your loss, but then celebrate the honesty that you bring to documenting that loss and actually absolutely helping other people, readers who will be going through this. So would you read the bit and then we'll open it up to other people?
Yeah, sure. I've just very recently got glasses, which is quite exciting actually. I only lost one pair, but on the train. But it's another thing, here we go. So, I don't think I need to preface this. I mentioned Buford Delaney. I always call him Beaufort Delaney, but the Americans always call him Buford Delaney, as my dad would always refer to the musician Louis Armstrong. The Americans always say Louis Armstrong. So, we know a little bit of Delaney, Baldwin's spiritual father. So, growing up, I was distinctly aware of my father's confidence in his body. He would stride naked between the bathroom and the bedroom he shared with my mother, singing Louis Armstrong songs and making up limericks. Some of them actually very rude. I remember being very young. On one occasion, during a dramatic summer storm, he leapt outside butt naked with a bottle of shampoo and revelled in the rain as the family dog Polly danced around him, my father's voice bellowing across the garden. In the early stages of Alzheimer's, my father clung to his clothes, refusing to change them or have them washed. My mother would wait until he slept and then would whip his favourite trousers into the washing machine so as not to antagonise his increasingly volatile and unsure mind. Not wishing to change clothes and not wanting to wash are common symptoms in those with Alzheimer's. In my father's case, at times it seemed he wanted to cling onto his independence, but he also became terrified of change, which is not surprising given the dark vicissitudes of his brain. When he moved into care, his clothes were frequently scattered across the home. He would appear with one sock on or with just one shoe, as though defying the need for order. As he lost weight, his ill-fitting clothes became purely functional, a sharp contrast to his singular sartorial style of red trousers, bright green tweed suits, and flamboyant jackets. After a few months in care, my father refused to wear clothes at all. He would peel away the layers as though returning to a purer, timeless state. He wandered around the home, urinating where he pleased, refusing to be clothed. For a while he would go missing, only to turn up snoring on a neighbour's floor, or huddled in a cupboard in which his naked body lay curled like a question mark. And there's a little section, I mean, it's just a couple of pages on Baldwin. I'm going to skip a little bit about Baldwin, the theme of nakedness, but it's not so important. So Baldwin's accounts of nakedness in his fiction, which are associated with shame and terror, stand in contrast to dark raptures, Delaney's earliest known portrait of the writer, painted around 1941. More than a dozen portraits of Baldwin by Delaney survive, but it is this picture that captures the enigma of the aspiring writer, a moment in which he turned his back on his stepfather's wishes that he remained a minister and the year that he left home. In the portrait, a naked Baldwin sits in a bucolic scene, far removed from the bustling Harlem streets and from his father's oppressive gaze. In this portrait, it is striking how comfortable Baldwin must have been in the company of his mentor, who captures the young man's enigmatic qualities in abstract brushstrokes that are poised between the realms of darkness and light, vulnerability and confidence. Delaney rarely painted nudes, and his portrait of Baldwin suggests how important each artist was to the other. Delaney helped his young friend organise David Baldwin's funeral, that's Baldwin's stepfather, and in the absence of his biological father and then his stepfather, the painter became an influential father figure in New York and then later in Paris from the early 1950s. Baldwin's writings about Delaney suggest that he taught him much about life and art, that jazz and the blues were as sacred as the gospel music they had both listened to in their respective youths, that there is an important difference between looking and seeing. But it was Delaney's letters to Baldwin about the importance of love that seemed to resonate most clearly in the writer's work. Love, Delaney wrote, is everything and releases magic and the marvellous in the face of gravest tragedy, the shelter in which the miracle and honesty and the power of visions and continuity are housed. Delaney wrote to Baldwin in one letter, "Learning to love is learning to suffer deeply and with quietness," he wrote in another. Delaney's belief in the transformative power of love was tested through much of his adult life, as he endured crippling bouts of depression and self-doubt as an artist. In the early 1950s, at the age of 52, he moved to Paris to be closer to Baldwin, a city that offered some relief from the oppressive racism he'd endured in New York. At times, Delaney's behaviour was eccentric. On one occasion, he hid a painting under his bed because he refused to sell it to a buyer whom he did not like, even though he was barely able to afford the tools of his trade. And then, in an echo of my own father, who began to experience visions and delusions, Delaney's behaviour became increasingly erratic as he experienced prolonged bouts of paranoia, which included him hearing increasingly noisy voices around him. By the early 1970s, as Alzheimer's disease found its way into Delaney's brain, the spiritual father was increasingly in need of support from his spiritual son. He was under doctor's orders to abstain from alcohol, an order he lightly forgot or ignored, just like my own father, who gulped with gusto after he replenished his guest glasses. So my dad would sort of do that. He was a great host, but you knew he'd make sure everyone was served first, but then he would chug away. Everything in moderation is immoderate, my father would tell me, as he uncorked a third bottle of wine. In the last year before he left home for a new kind of home, my father forgot that he'd given up smoking, something which gave him a shored-up pleasure, even as I worried about where he would discard his cigarette ends. Towards the end of his time at home, he no longer realised that he was being plied with non-alcoholic beer and wine. And that really worked. There was sort of non-alcoholic beer, and he said, "This is great." Really, my dad, my dad started smoking at the age of 8, and not solidly from 8, but he sort of tried it and got addicted by 9. So he was only having, it was one of the benefits of dementia that he forgot that he smoked. As he neared death, Delaney, as his biographer puts it, could not cope with the details of life. Lord knows how disorientating it must have been for Delaney as the voices and paranoia coiled around his diseased brain. And while Baldwin helped with his finances and hospital appointments, there must have been long periods when he was alone, confused and terrified. In my father's case, my mother's love and patience helped to anchor him, even as he became increasingly unmoored. He sought out the company of the displaced, just as Delaney's apartment in France became overrun by squatters. For Delaney, a native of Tennessee, I wonder how he fared as his memory failed him, and how much the French language added to his bewilderment. Delaney died in 1979, 8 years before Baldwin, and the year in which his spiritual son published his first novel, Just Above My Head. Towards the end, Delaney's biographer observes that he simply stopped fighting and took no interest in painting, just as my father has no interest in books, his lifelong passion. But I'm not sure that Alzheimer's can be fought, however, or defeated. It is a meta-disease of sorts in which the brain suffocates the brain, slowly strangling itself until the body is ruptured from the mind. And unlike the peace that death can bring, this disease haunts those that it leaves behind, whose mourning begins before death arrives. There is an achingly beautiful photograph of Baldwin and Delaney taken a year before the painter's death. Both men are glancing to their left. Baldwin, looking like a rock star in sunglasses and hip top, is clasping Delaney's left hand. Their fingers meshed while the writer's left hand grips his hospital gown as though holding on for support. Baldwin's gaze is commanding even through his sunglasses, while Delaney's once keen eyes are unfocused, adrift. When his mentor died the following year, Baldwin did not attend the funeral, explaining that he was acting like a spoilt son, somehow angry at his father for dying without his permission, which is reminiscent of the feelings I have towards my father's long, now silent death. I find reasons not to visit him in the care home, which is an experience that fills me with fear and guilty revulsion. Letting go when hands are interwoven and when life imitates death is not easy, just as echoes of my father remain just above my head. There we go.
So, questions about Doug's book, about anything we've been speaking about.
And yours.
Well, I would just, in that regard, I shared this with Doug before we came over. Ted Hughes wrote a brilliant, strange, mad book called Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being in 1992. And it was reviewed in the Times by Eric Griffiths. Hughes didn't know that, like Ted, Eric had been a Pembroke English graduate. He was a famously brilliant, famously savage intellect. And one sentence in particular in the introduction to Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being attracted my attention when I read Eric Griffiths' review of it. And it was, more or less, everything depends on acquiring the simple Polaroids that enable one to cut through the surface glitter of the plot to the mythic planes beneath. That's Hughes. Griffiths quoted this and said, "What is there beneath language? What an absurd statement." I then went to find the book because the essential Polaroids are what fishermen wear to cut through the surface of water and see the fish beneath. And Pembroke had a copy of this in its library, and I read it twice, 500 pages, and the sentence was not in it. And then I realised this was the American edition of this book, published 3 months afterwards. And Ted had rewritten the introduction in response to this and cut this sentence out. And he sent a revised text of the introduction to Seamus Heaney after having complained to the Times, editor Derwent May. And he reflects on Eric Griffiths' inability to register transformation and the mystery of transformation and that access to the mythic plane. And there's one sentence. You mentioned you'd been interested in the mythic poets business in My Goddess. This is to Seamus. That part, last 10 pages of my introduction, seems to be now like a system of tank traps. Few get past it, I guess. So I rewrote it, as enclosed, simpler, clearer, and I thought the example might interest you for the US edition. Low-tech terminology. Then he says, the positive hatred of the English intelligentsia. Is there such a thing? Acadamentia, maybe. For what I mean by mythic goes right back to the 17th century. It has that kind of radical, unconscious instinctiveness about it. You cling to categories, you don't allow for complexity and mystery. Acadamentia. So there are a number of people here who are engaged in projects that could have been strictly and purely academic, in disciplined very hugely in the use of the eye and the reliance on personal experience. So I just welcome questions about Doug's book, about Ted Hughes, about Baldwin, or offerings from anyone in the audience about anything we've said. Don't be shy. Dan.
I've got a question about, you said you haven't shown it to your mother or your sisters, and that you'd be open to, and the word you used was redrafting. So it's a sort of hypothetical, although if they then read it, how do you think we would respond if they said, I can't believe you said X about Dad, please cut it? Because there's, in that position, the writer has broadly 3 options, which is to refuse point blank, to go with the request for the cut unnegotiated, or to haggle. So of those 3, where do you think you would sit?
I think I'd probably, if it's my sisters, I'd probably regress and pull her pigtails, and then we'd have a fight about something. No, it's a good question. I mean, I don't think I was saying I would redraft because it's in print now, so I can't, it's too late for that. But there are moments, I think, this is my slight, minor anxiety about it because it's fixed now. I can't undo that. But I think, and I hope that it would be something that we'd have a conversation about that would be kind of generative about our father and about our perceptions of that. So I'm not too worried. I'm just a little bit, there's a slight anxiety, which is, I think, understandable because it's material which it doesn't always paint my father in a flattering light, for example. I mean, there are bits that I allude to about my father's infidelities, for example, you know, which we've I did check with my mum, you know, about that, and she knew about that. She's okay about that, but there are other bits where, yeah, I think there are bits. I think I'm most worried about my youngest sister, who has found it most difficult, I think, to deal with our father's death, and just that she'll want to read it but find it very difficult to read because it's a kind of dredging up of all sorts of things that she's trying to deal with. So, but it's an interesting question more broadly about what happens when you write. I think, you know, when I wrote the piece in the TLS, I was a bit nervous about that, and this is the bit about my father. My mum loved it, and you can tell when my mum loves it because she sends it around to her friends and says, Doogie, as she calls me embarrassingly, has got a piece, you know, and it's something that my mum, who's very bright but isn't academic, doesn't read, and, you know, with good reason, doesn't want to read a lot of, you know, traditional academic scholarship, nor do I these days, unless it's written well. But it's, but I was surprised by her openness to this because it's quite a public forum. So yeah, I mean, I just slight trouble. I've counted this. I dedicate the book to my mum and sisters. I thought that was quite smart, because if they say, you know, but I dedicate the book, you know, I mean, you know, always thinking. But it's a fascinating question. I've thought about this a lot, you know, and I remember taking a course at University of York with Hermione Leon in the late 90s about memoir, and these are sort of things that came up, you know, that in the late 90s where there was a spate of fascinating moment where lots of autobiographies were being published in the UK and US, books that were, you know, some of them really difficult subject matters. So yeah, we'll wait and see. Feel free to check in a couple of weeks' time if I'm unscathed.
But the book will always be there. Mind you, there's always a potential for paperback. It's the odd tweak.
Yeah, I've just, as I was reading, I noticed a typo.
And reading aloud is when you notice it too. I did the audiobook of The Cat, and it was then that proofreaders had proved that they weren't as good as they should have been, and me too. But the book will always be there, and they don't have to read it in the next fortnight. It might be that they need it in 10 years' time, you know. I
hope they don't. I was at a talk by the writer Amy Littrop, and some of you may have seen the film of her memoir, The Outrun. Has anybody seen that? It's so I haven't seen it yet, but she's a good friend of mine. But I was away. It was actually the film was out in Hebden Bridge. It was the weekend that my dad died. I couldn't see it, and I know her partner very well. I know her kids, and it's fascinating. You know, she's been open about this. Is, you know, I've written this and it's there, but particularly with a film, I mean, they've changed some elements. It's quite a tricky kind of moment. But I remember Amy was at an event run by Caught by the River, and I went to hear her give a reading about the second book, and she said, which I thought was a great kind of way of thinking about it. She said it was, people asked her about it, she said it was the best book I could have written at the time. And it was a very good, you know, when I wrote a lot of this book when we were between homes, it sounds very glamorous, it wasn't, in Sicily.
It's quite glamorous.
It's quite glamorous, yeah. but it wasn't as glamorous as that sounds. And I was writing it surrounded by children. In fact, there's in the acknowledgement, there's a thank you to Cocomelon, which is a children's TV thing, who kind of kept my kids occupied. It's like, don't go on screens, go on screens. I need to write this chapter. But it was definitely the best book I could have written. And it mentioned talking about real time. It was strange because I would go and visit my father, and sometimes I felt guilty because I didn't go very often, but I would go and I would take notes and take photographs, and then I'd feel guilty about doing that. You know, in the same way, was I, with your father, was I documenting him? I mean, there are no photographs in the book, but then feeling guilty because maybe I wasn't as present, but then I think I was doing that because I didn't want to be as present at the moment. I mean, I found it very, very difficult to see.
But with my father, I mean, I was fishing and researching this book on Hughes within 10 miles, 20 miles of where Dad was lying in hospital dying.
Yes.
But I couldn't write that or it didn't feel, and you're not just you narratively right, for years after that.
Yeah.
So I do admire you for having done it now.
I mean, the question of tenses, which I talk about, is really fascinating and kind of troubling, I think, when people have talk about someone with dementia, because you catch yourself. I catch myself saying, "Oh, my dad used to love cricket," or "My dad used to love Beethoven," or whatever, pubs, red trousers, whatever, and then you sort of think, "Oh no, but he still doesn't know," but he doesn't, you know, and there's a moment where dementia upends our notion of narrative, of knowing, of tenses, you know, and it's really our sense of self. You know, who is the self without any memory of that self? And these are issues I trace lightly, I think, and not too much depth, but they go back to kind of ancient Roman Greek times. You know, these are you know, when these have been debated about. You know, Locke, late 16th century, talking about basically judging the sense of selfhood on memory. So when memory goes, what does that mean? But these are culturally embedded, at least in the UK and West more broadly, I think. But then also neuroscientists have argued that we don't remember nearly as much as we think we do. So there's a kind of counterpoint to the new work that's coming out. You know, we think we see a lot, but actually we see only a fraction of what we think we see. Memories are memories of memories. And in fact, when we call up memories, when we recall a memory, the act of recalling it diminishes the original memory. You know, it's so you look back to try and get clarity, but actually you're eroding that kind of. You know, it's fascinating. I got a bit sick of it today, but I was reading books and books on. It's fascinating to do, but it's quite. I don't know. It's quite. I don't want to kind of end on a downer, but it's quite terrifying though. Just the figures for dementia, and you know 150 million worldwide by 2050. You know, and 50 million or so at the moment. But as we live longer, but it's not. It doesn't mean, which I found quite comforting. I've just worked with a dementia research fellow. It doesn't mean if one of your parents has it that you're more likely to. There's a kind of genetic makeup and things.
But animals don't get it, Mike.
Have you had any feedback yet from your more academic friends?
No, a couple of academic friends read it, and it was interesting. Some of the feedback was useful, but it was trying to get me to shape the book in a way that I didn't want to do. So, for example, a good friend and colleague who's brilliant. Her suggestion was to put the bits about my father sort of at the beginning, perhaps italicized, and then have the Baldwin stuff. And I really didn't want to do that. I wanted the book to kind of think through Baldwin and my father. To ebb and flow, weave in and out of the book, and I'm happy I stuck with that. I think that, and it was very organic for me. You know, I've just been writing, thinking, but I'm also not too fussed about the critical reactions to the book because I have written it and I'm pleased that I've written it. I really, you know, I'm. As I say, the process has been good. I mean, don't get me wrong. If I get a real, I got a terrible review in the Morning Star, which was quite funny actually. It was comically bad. Yeah. But it was comically bad, and the headline was misreading the activist, and basically they chastised me. It was a retired Shakespeare scholar who was naturally reviewing this book on Baldwin and my father, and she said I didn't talk about Gaza and Baldwin's view. I'd written it before, this had happened. And then that I didn't say enough about the influence of communism, what was writing, but they did print my letter, which I had real fun constructing over a pint of claret, and it was, I was quoting Trotsky back and Baldwin, and it made no sense. It's a bit like chastising. It was about saying, I'm going to write a thriller, and the reviewer says this is a terrible work of romantic fiction. You know, it wasn't, but that's part of the problem in a way with readers of Baldwin. Everyone lays claim to Baldwin, you know, in a sense.
How long did it take you to write?
How long it took me to write? It took me. I started it on April Fool's Day, and I finished it on December the 15th when I was working in Sicily. But I then spent longer revising and editing and so forth. So the way I write quite quickly, and then I edit and go back. So that's my. Yeah.
So Rob McFarlane on Monday was talking about the torrent of writing after an adventure that he's had, and then the monk state that he enters, rewriting and reading, and agonising. But yeah,
and
the fun bit is when you edit, isn't it? Actually?
Yeah, I really enjoy that process, and I've been very lucky over the years. I've worked with some brilliant editors, who, you know, really the unsung heroes. I mean, I've handed in some pretty average pieces for the TLS, and they've come back and I'm like, wow, that's brilliant. It wasn't really me, it was the editor. You know, and that is really. I don't think I've never done anything slapdash for the TLS, but or last minute. But they have really. It's such a skill and such an art, and I worked with a very good editor on this book as well.
Are there other views about drawing explicitly on personal experience? Because I know disciplinary frameworks vary very significantly. So I thought, Hildegard.
Yeah, no, definitely in the sense that, again, anthropology is absolutely what we do. Also because especially after increasing methodological reflections about how you position yourself and what you learn about the world, the people, from a particular position, somehow have to declare from which angles you are actually observing things. And from that point of view, the eye has become increasingly important. So that is really interesting, and often actually brings us to ethnographic accounts that tend to be literary in the sense that, you know, and the use of words to elicit emotion, impression, atmospheres, very much related to the eye. And actually I had a question that I was kind of musing around, in a sense that at the beginning you were mentioning the sense of place. And I was wondering, you know, in what places play a part in the narrative, because I'm coming from a completely different tradition. I worked a lot on Tibetan biographies, autobiographies, and there is a very tight connection to the landscape and to pilgrimage practices, so that actually the narratives are often recreating these spaces and places where these lives have been led and miracles have been made and encounters happen, but also people go to these places to re-encounter the great figures. So when you're describing the tracing the steps of Ted Hughes, you say, yes, it sounds exactly like the way in which the biographical tradition relates to pilgrimage.
Although curiously for me, because I was fishing with people who I encountered through his diaries and then contacting them in their 70s and 80s, I was the first person again and again to have asked them about Ted back in the 80s and 90s. And the place where my book starts, on the River Torridge in Devon, is half a mile from Michael Morpurgo's house, and that's where he drew inspiration for Warhorse, and the farm there is now known as Warhorse Valley. And the farmer who took me down to the river where Ted had this wonderful encounter with a salmon needed convincing first from Carol Hughes that I was okay, and she thought then that I was, but also he just thought, oh, here's another one looking for Warhorse. And so actually, and so the specificity of place, and there was a follow-up then. When I was writing it, and it was kind of delusions of how many people would read the book, there is a question of how, and actually Christopher Reid was talking about Seamus Heaney's defensiveness in the exposure of the River Moyola and the farmland down to the Moyola, from which he drew so many of his poems. He was very hurt indeed when a critic, a scholar, went and interviewed his family, because he said, this is my territory, you can't expose this. And I thought, will I, in exposing these places, produce a whole wave? This is delusions of grandeur of kind of Hughes scholars. But in my case, no one had done it before. And in a way, meeting these guys who had access to very privileged, expensive bits of river or lake that no one else had fished in, no one could have done it at any other point than mine. But it did raise these questions of, do you protect the place or do you expose them? So then the writing has to do the work of evoking place without encouraging people to go as trespassing as we did, as I did, and sometimes Ben, my son. Yeah.
Yeah, but I can imagine that the sense of place then acquires an additional dimension when it's related also to memory loss, in the sense that, and you know, thinking about personal experiences with very old people, you know, and when you kind of revisit experiences, very often is the reference to a particular place or a particular object that kind of trigger, for example, a situation, recalling, and it's often in terms of describing a place or really particular features in a setting. Yeah.
It says also, I mean, even more than place, I think with in dementia studies, it's music, which is often the kind of key thing, and there's a sense that music can put you back into a particular place as well. So there's a kind of way. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I was really struck by my father was losing his bearings. He was wandering around Shrewsbury, the town where he lived in the centre with my mum, and then he would there was a house that he loved. It was a kind of mock Tudor, but still quite old, beautiful building. There's something. I mean, my dad never bought a house. He certainly couldn't have afforded a window from it. But he was convinced that he lived there, and so we'd wander there, and then he'd say, "It's got a house that he loved architecture." My dad, and he would say, "I'm just going home." Or he would sort of try and get into the house and that sort of thing. But then he spent lots of time with homeless people. My dad did lots of Samaritans, prison visiting. My dad was always very sympathetic about like you need to understand people.
I something occurred to me, which is prompted by what you said about music. I met Barry Cook, this painter fisherman who was the closest friend of Ted Hughes and of Seamus Heaney, and when he was living independently. And that was extraordinary, this immersion in the life of an artist. But then, the year later, I was going to reunite him with a battered stuffed trout, which he had taken over to swap for a carving of a salmon he'd seen in a pub in Devon, and it hadn't worked. And Olwyn, Ted's sister, said, "Restore this to Barry." So I went, and by that point he'd moved, and he'd developed dementia. He was no longer safe living independently. And he was living in warden-controlled accommodation in the southeast of Ireland, in County Kilkenny. And I delivered this trout to Julia, his daughter, living in the same village. And she said, "Dad might not remember that he's agreed to meet you." So she rang him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I want to see Mark." So I turned up the next morning, and he was getting dressed, pulling his trousers on, kind of chaotic, but made me a cup of tea. And she said, as well as losing his short-term memory, he's lost the letters. Somewhere in the move from Sligo down to County Kilkenny, they've gone. And I said, "What letters?" "All the letters that his poet friends sent to him." And I sat there and I read him, not music, but a 200-line verse fishing diary that Ted had written of catching his first Irish salmon with Barry. And he was closer to me than you, in this very not oak-panelled room, really grotty, Spartan maisonette. And I read him this diary, which ended, "It's the most beautiful salmon I've ever seen," said Barry. And he said, "Mark," he leant forward and said, "Mark, I did say that." And it was. And then he said, "Would you like to see the letters?" And he pulled this curtain behind from a cupboard cold, brought out this cardboard box, which held leeks, vegetables, and stuffed with these extraordinary letters, and an unknown fair copy manuscript of a poem from Seamus, and Robert Lowell manuscript. And I spent an hour with them, told the daughters, and eventually we've got them here at Pembroke. But it wouldn't have happened, curiously, without dementia and short-term memory loss yielding to this deep love of his old friend from 40 years ago, 35 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the way that the brain works it's absolutely fascinating. I had this with moments with my father. Sometimes it was quite funny. I mean, there's a lot of gloom and, there's this sort of declension narrative. But for a while, my dad was drinking non-alcoholic beer and wine and saying, I'm not having another one of those. And then he got really fixated on Mary Berry. I just couldn't stand it, and I don't really know why. Really, he wasn't a hateful man, but my word, he became, he just couldn't stand her. You couldn't talk about her, She came on the TV, get that fucking woman off. I don't know why that happened. I thought she was just a nice lady that cooked cake, made cakes and stuff. Anyway, maybe there's maybe he was intuited something dark about her. And there were moments where he had a sign as he went into their ramshackle flat that said, I've lost my mind and I'm making no effort to look for it. And then he would say, oh, the doctors say I've got this German disease and I don't think I have, without referring to Alzheimer's. And he would do a sort of a German accent and say so there were moments that were quite funny, but then there were moments where it was that slippage between humour and being able to laugh about it, and then kind of paranoia. But I think I'd still look back on some of those moments with great fondness. Yeah. There were and there were moments when he knew that he'd made mistakes, and he was, as you alluded to, a terrific sense of humour. So he, also found it funny. So there are bits like that which I think are important to remember. And I think more broadly with illness and dementia, there are moments where it's very funny, not laughing at people, but just in the whole, the absurdity of life. It's quite sort of Beckettian, in certain things.
It's 7:30. So I'd just like to thank you, Doug. You've been amazingly generous, open, lyrical, profound on Baldwin, who, if anyone else is as slow to the party as I have been, read now urgently. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for